At 4:51 in the morning on May 11, 1945, a Japanese sword came down through the canvas of an American tent on the island of Luzon. It was aimed at the throat of a sleeping 24-year-old private from Georgia, a sharecropper's son, a man with a third-grade education who had learned to hunt before he had learned to read. The blade missed his throat by 2 inches. It sliced off part of his ear instead. In the next 36 minutes, that farm boy from Scavenging County would kill approximately 40 enemy soldiers with a rifle butt, and his bare hands. He would save an entire American company from being wiped out in their sleep. He would earn the Medal of Honor from the hand of President Harry Truman. And then he would go home to Georgia, put the medal in a drawer, and never speak about that morning for the rest of his life. His name was John R. McKinney. This is his story, and it is not a legend. Every detail you are about to hear is documented in the official records of the United States Army, in the Medal of Honor citation signed on his behalf, and in the careful research of the veteran-turned-writer who spent years tracking down the truth of what happened that morning at Dingalan Bay. To understand what he did, you have to understand the boy he had been. John McKinney was born in 1921 in a place called Woodcliff, a scattering of farmhouses and dirt roads in Scavenging County, Georgia. His father was a sharecropper. That word carried weight in the American South in those years. It meant you worked another man's land, gave him most of what you grew, and kept whatever was left to feed your family. Most sharecroppers did not keep much. The McKinney family had almost nothing. They lived in a small wooden house with a tin roof that leaked when the summer storms came through. They had chickens in the yard and a garden behind the house, and beyond the garden stretched miles of pine forest and cypress swamp. That forest was not decoration. That forest was groceries. By the time John was 8 years old, his father had put a .22 caliber rifle in his hands and taught him how to hunt. There was no ceremony to it. There was no lesson about safety or sport. There was only the simple lesson of survival. If John could shoot, the family would eat. If he could not, they would not. He learned. He learned to move through the woods without breaking twigs. He learned to read the ground for tracks. He learned the difference between the sound of a squirrel jumping between branches and the sound of a bird landing on a limb. He learned to hold his breath, to squeeze rather than pull, to lead a moving target by exactly the right amount. By the age of 12, John McKinney could hit a squirrel in the head at 50 yards with a .22. He never bragged about this. He would not have known how. He simply came home each evening with whatever he had shot, and his mother turned it into supper, and the family survived another day. The Great Depression had settled over the American South like a slow disease. Cotton prices collapsed. Banks failed. Families that had been poor became something worse than poor. In Scavenging County, children grew up thin. Some grew up hungry. Some did not grow up at all. John McKinney's family survived because he could shoot. School was a different matter. He walked 3 miles each way to a small country schoolhouse when his father could spare him from the farm, which was not often. He learned his letters. He learned to sound out simple words. He learned that other children could read whole books while he still struggled with single sentences. Something in his mind did not connect to the printed page the way it was supposed to. By the 3rd grade, he had stopped trying. He left school for good and went to work full-time on the farm and in the woods. He was 10 years old. For the next 12 years, John McKinney lived the life that had been laid out for him from the moment of his birth. He plowed fields. He picked cotton. He trapped rabbits. He shot deer. He learned every creek and clearing and hunting trail within 20 miles of his home. He grew into a lean, quiet young man with steady hands and eyes that noticed everything. Then came December 7th, 1941. The news of Pearl Harbor reached rural Georgia the way all news reached rural Georgia in those years, slowly through radios and general stores and newspapers that arrived a day late. But it reached everyone eventually, and in every small town across the American South, young men who had never traveled more than 50 miles from home began walking to recruiting offices. John McKinney enlisted at Fort McPherson in November of 1942. He was 21 years old. The Army processing officers looked at his paperwork with careful expressions. He could not read most of the forms they handed him. He signed his name in the slow, careful way of someone who had learned to write only the letters he absolutely needed. His medical exam showed a healthy young man. His intelligence tests showed something the Army did not know quite what to do with. Then they took him to the rifle range. The drill sergeants had seen thousands of new recruits come through basic training. Most had never fired a weapon in their lives. Some had done a little hunting. A few showed real promise. The sergeants had a general sense of what to expect. They had not expected John McKinney. He put his first 3 shots into a group the size of a nickel at 100 yards. The instructor watched him load a fresh clip and put 5 more rounds through nearly the same hole. The instructor called over another sergeant. That sergeant called over an officer. Within an hour, half the training staff had gathered behind the firing line to watch a barely literate farm boy from Georgia outshoot every soldier on the range. They tried him at 200 yards. He hit every target. They tried him at 300 yards with a moving target and a stiff crosswind. He hit that too. One of the sergeants asked him how long he had been shooting. McKinney thought about the question. Then he said, in his slow Georgia drawl, that he could not remember not shooting. The Army noticed something else about him during basic training. He moved differently than the other recruits. When the men were sent on night exercises through the pine forests of Fort McPherson, most of them stumbled and cursed and made noise. McKinney simply disappeared. He would enter the woods with his squad and reappear at the objective without anyone hearing him come or go. The instructors decided that whatever the Army had gotten in John McKinney, they had gotten something rare. They shipped him to the Pacific in 1943 with the 33rd Infantry Division. The men of that division carried a golden cross on their shoulder patch. They would fight through some of the worst terrain and worst weather and worst enemies of the entire war. New Guinea first, then the long, slow march north through the islands toward Japan. McKinney survived it all. He survived the malaria that took down soldiers around him every week. He survived the dysentery that left men too weak to walk. He survived the leeches and the fungal infections and the endless rain and the food that was not really food. He survived firefights and ambushes and long weeks of patrol through terrain that killed men just for entering it. By the time his division reached the Philippines in early 1945, John McKinney was a veteran in the truest sense of the word. He was 24 years old and he looked 40. He said very little. He kept to himself. He did his duty without complaint. The men in his squad knew 2 things about him. He was the best shot in the company, and he slept with his rifle. That rifle was about to matter more than anything else in his life. By May of 1945, the war in the Pacific had entered its final and most desperate phase. The great naval battles were mostly over. The Japanese fleet had been shattered at Leyte Gulf. American forces had recaptured Manila after some of the ugliest urban fighting of the entire war. But on the island of Luzon, tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers refused to surrender. Their commander, General Tomoyuki Yamashita, had made a decision. He would not fight the Americans in the open. He would take his forces into the mountains and the jungles. He would make them pay for every mile with blood. He would delay the inevitable end of the war for as long as humanly possible, because every day he delayed was a day that Japan itself might negotiate better terms. The Japanese soldiers still fighting on Luzon in May of 1945 were not the polished troops of 1941. They were exhausted men. They were starving. Many were sick. But they were also dangerous in a way that fresh soldiers never are. They knew they were going to die. They had accepted it. And men who have accepted their own deaths are the most terrifying enemies a soldier can face. The American campaign on Luzon had already cost more than 60,000 casualties by early May. The Philippine countryside was scattered with small American outposts guarding supply routes, road junctions, coastal areas. Each of those outposts was a potential target. Each night, somewhere on the island, Japanese soldiers were creeping through the jungle toward American positions. On the night of May 10th, one of those small outposts belonged to Company A of the 123rd Infantry Regiment. They had set up near Dingalan Bay to guard a supply route running through the coastal jungle. 12 tents, a machine gun position, perimeter guards, standard doctrine for a temporary defensive position. John McKinney had pulled the late shift at the machine gun that night. 2 other men had been with him. One of them was a private named Hendrik X. The other was a soldier whose name the records do not preserve. All three of them had spent the darkest hours of the night staring into the jungle, listening for any sound that did not belong. The jungle had been quiet. At about 4 in the morning, McKinney had handed his post over. He had walked the short distance to his tent. He had taken off his helmet and set it beside his cot. He had laid down with his M1 Garand rifle against his right side, the way he always did, and he had closed his eyes. He did not know that the jungle had not really been quiet. He did not know that for the past 3 days, Japanese scouts had been watching the American outpost from concealed positions in the trees. They had counted the tents. They had counted the men. They had timed the guard rotations. They had noted which tent held the officers and which tent held the machine gun crew. They had also noted the tent where the man who slept with his rifle spent his off-duty hours. Now, in the last hour before dawn, on May 11th, 1945, approximately 100 Japanese soldiers were moving in silence through the jungle toward the American perimeter. They carried Arisaka rifles. They carried grenades. They carried knee mortars, the small weapons the Americans had nicknamed after a mistaken belief that they could be braced against the thigh. Some of them carried swords. Their commanding officer had issued specific orders. The vanguard would slip past the outer guard posts undetected. They would eliminate the first Americans they encountered silently, using blades only. By the time the main force attacked, the perimeter would already be compromised. The camp would be overrun before the Americans could form any organized defense. There would be no survivors. The first Japanese soldier reached the outer edge of the American perimeter at 4:49 in the morning. He saw the machine gun position. He saw the guards. He signaled to the men behind him. The vanguard split into small teams. Each team moved toward a specific tent. They had memorized the layout. They knew exactly where to go. One of those teams was led by an officer's name history has not preserved. His orders were simple. He was to eliminate the occupant of a specific tent on the western side of the perimeter. The occupant was a machine gunner who had just come off duty. He would be asleep. He would be unarmed or barely armed. It would take one strike. The officer drew his sword. He crossed the last few yards of open ground in absolute silence. He reached the tent of Private John R. McKinney at 4:51 in the morning. Inside the tent, the sharecropper's son from Screven County was sleeping. His rifle was against his side. His helmet was on the ground beside his cot. He was dreaming, or perhaps he was not dreaming. Later, he would not remember. He would not remember much of the next 36 minutes, but the men who came for him would remember, the ones who survived. They would carry the memory of what happened in that clearing back through the jungle with them. They would try to explain it to their commanding officers. They would fail, because no one on either side of that battle would be able to fully explain what a farm boy from Georgia with a third-grade education was capable of when someone tried to kill him in his sleep. The officer raised the sword above his head. He brought it down. In the microsecond before it struck, something happened in the tent that no one would ever be able to fully explain. Perhaps McKinney heard the canvas rustle. Perhaps his body sensed a shift in the air above him. Perhaps 24 years of hunting had wired his nervous system to respond to a predator's approach before his conscious mind understood what was happening. He moved. Not much. Not far. Just an involuntary jerk of the head and shoulders, the way a sleeping man twitches when a fly lands on his face. It was enough. The sword had been aimed at his throat. In the pitch black of the tent, the Japanese officer could not see his target with any precision. He was cutting toward a shape on a cot, guided by memory and the sound of breathing. When McKinney moved, the geometry of the strike changed. The blade came down 2 inches wide of where it should have. It caught him on the right side of the head. According to the research of Forrest Bryant Johnson, who spent years piecing together the details of that morning, the blade sliced off part of his right ear. Blood erupted across the canvas of the tent in a hot black spray. McKinney's eyes snapped open to a world of searing pain and impossible darkness. Above him, a shape, a man, a silhouette outlined by the faintest gray light bleeding through the tent flap. The shape was raising something. The shape was raising a sword. There was no time to think. There was no time to speak. There was no time to feel the pain that was tearing through the side of his head. There was only the wiring of his body, the deep old instinct of a boy who had grown up in a house where a slow reaction meant a hungry family. His right hand found the M1 Garand rifle beside him. He did not lift it. He did not aim it. He did not fire it. He swung it. 9.5 pounds of walnut and steel came around in a short, flat arc from the side of the cot. The butt plate caught the Japanese officer under the chin at the point where the jaw meets the throat. The impact traveled up through the officer's skull. His teeth broke. His neck snapped backward. The sword fell from his hand. McKinney swung the rifle again. Then a third time. He did not stop swinging until the shape above him had stopped being a shape and had become something else, something on the floor of the tent that was no longer a threat. He sat up on the cot. His breath came in short, ragged pulls. Blood was pouring down the side of his face, soaking his collar, dripping onto his hands. The pain in his head was a white light that made it hard to think. Then he heard the sounds outside the tent. Footsteps. Running feet. Many of them. Rifle fire. Screaming. The distinctive sharp crack of Japanese Arisaka rifles, mixing with the heavier bass note of American M1 Garands. The main attack had begun. He grabbed his helmet. He fumbled for his ammunition belt. His hands were slippery with blood, and his own blood or someone else's, he could not tell. He pushed the tent flap open and stepped out into the last darkness before dawn. The first thing he saw was fire. Muzzle flashes were strobing in the darkness all across the perimeter. Tracer rounds were cutting green and white lines through the humid air. The camp had exploded into chaos in the 60 seconds since he had killed the man in his tent. He could hear voices shouting in English. He could hear voices shouting in Japanese. He could not tell which was closer. The machine gun position was 30 yards. You could see figures around it. Some were down. Some were still moving. In the pulsing light of the muzzle flashes, he saw enemy soldiers swarming toward the sandbags. He saw an American shape drag another American shape backward, away from the gun toward the interior of the camp. Private Hendricks had taken a bayonet wound to the shoulder in the first seconds of the attack. The third man on the crew had made the split-second decision to save his comrade rather than defend the gun. It was the right decision. Hendricks would have died otherwise, but it meant that the machine gun was undefended. The machine gun was the position. The machine gun covered the main approach from the jungle. If the Japanese took that gun and turned it around, they would be able to sweep the entire American perimeter from inside the wire. Every man in Company A would die in his tent or trying to get out of it. John McKinney understood this in the space of a single heartbeat. He did not wait for orders. He did not look for cover. He did not consider the fact that the entire assault force was moving between him and the objective. He gripped his rifle and he ran. Straight at the gun. Straight at the enemy. The Japanese soldiers around the machine gun saw him coming. In the strobing light, they saw a lone American with blood pouring down his face, sprinting directly toward them across open ground. Some of them turned to face this new threat. Some kept trying to reverse the gun. McKinney raised the M1 as he ran. The first man went down at 20 yards, the second at 15. He was not aiming the way a soldier at a rifle range aims. He was pointing the way a hunter points at a flushed bird, letting his eye and his rifle become the same thing. The M1 Garand roared and roared again. Brass casing spun through the air behind him. He reached the sandbag wall of the machine gun position. He did not slow down. He went over the top. Inside the small, square space of the gun pit, he came down among men who had come here to kill Americans and found something they had not planned for. In the seconds that followed, the M1 Garand emptied its clip at ranges measured in inches. The rifle pinged as the last round ejected, the empty clip flying up out of the receiver with the sound that every American infantryman knew. That sound told the enemy the rifle was empty, but the rifle was still a weapon. McKinney reversed his grip on it. The stock became a club. The steel butt plate became an axe. In the tight space of the gun pit, he swung the M1 the way a man swings a felling maul, and he did not stop swinging until the pit was still. He grabbed the machine gun. He tried to work the bolt. Something was wrong. In the struggle, the feed tray had been bent. The bolt would not seat. The most important weapon in the perimeter was now a piece of scrap metal. He crouched behind the sandbags. His breath came in short, shallow pulls. His right ear was a mass of torn meat and clotting blood. His head rang from the impact of the sword strike. His hands would not quite stop shaking. For just a moment, he became aware of his own body. His hands were slippery. His uniform was heavy with blood. He could not hear anything at all on his right side, and he understood, without wanting to understand it, that this was probably permanent. He was 24 years old and half deaf in a jungle 6,000 miles from Georgia. He would remember this moment later, or he would remember not remembering it. Decades afterward, when a writer finally got him to speak about the war, he would say that he could not really recall what he was thinking during those minutes. There were pictures in his head. There were sounds. There was pain. But the ordinary thread of thought that connects one moment to the next had come apart. What was left was something older, something that lived below thought. He reached down and pulled a bandolier of ammunition from one of the dead men beside him. American .30 caliber rounds. The Japanese soldier had taken them from some previous engagement or from some previous corpse. War is like that. Things pass from hand to hand. McKinney loaded a fresh clip into his rifle. He rested the barrel on the sandbag wall. He waited. The second wave came out of the tree line at a run. 20 men, maybe 25. Bayonets fixed. Rifles held across their chests. They were screaming as they charged, the way soldiers scream to keep themselves moving forward when everything in them wants to stop. McKinney put the front sight on the man in the lead. Then he did what he had been born to do. The M1 Garand fired 8 rounds as fast as a man could pull a trigger. Every shot found a target, 60 yards, 50, 40. He led each man exactly the way he had led deer through the pine woods of home. Squeeze, shift, squeeze, shift. The rifle pinged empty. He slammed in a fresh clip in less than 3 seconds. He kept firing. By the time the second wave broke and the survivors scattered back toward the trees, there were more bodies on the ground in front of the gun pit than any single rifleman should have been able to produce. But he was not any single rifleman. He was a farm boy who had put food on his family's table with a small caliber rifle from the age of 8, and every shot he had ever taken in his life had been aimed at something that would feed his mother if it fell, and would leave his brothers hungry if it did not. He had never missed then. He was not missing now. He heard the hollow thump from the jungle before he understood what it was. Then another thump, then a third. Knee mortars. The Japanese commander had recognized what he was up against, or thought he had. He believed there were multiple riflemen in interlocking positions across the American perimeter. He was going to soften those positions with indirect fire before he committed another wave. The first mortar round exploded 10 yards to McKinney's left. Dirt and shrapnel sprayed across the sandbags. The second round hit closer. The third landed on the parapet itself, and the world went white for a moment, and when it came back the wall of sandbags had partially collapsed, and McKinney was half exposed to the tree line. He understood that if he stayed, he would die. He grabbed 2 bandoliers of ammunition from the dead soldiers around him. He slung them across his shoulders. He came up out of the ruined gun pit at a low run. Rifle fire cracked from the tree line. Rounds snapped past his head. He felt one tug at the loose fabric of his sleeve. He threw himself into a shallow depression in the ground, 15 yards from the pit. It was not a foxhole. It was barely a wrinkle in the dirt, but it was enough to break the enemy's line of sight, and that was all he needed. He crawled to the edge of the depression. The Japanese saw him move away from the gun pit. They believed he was running. They believed he was retreating. 2 squads emerged from the tree line at a fast walk, moving toward the abandoned position, thinking they were mopping up what was left of the American defense. McKinney let them get to 30 yards. Then he opened fire from an angle they were not looking at. The point man fell first, then the man behind him, then the man behind that. The group scrambled, tried to find cover, tried to figure out where the fire was coming from. 3 more of them went down before they located his muzzle flash. He was already moving again, 10 yards to the right, another shallow depression. A new firing angle. He was doing what he had done in the woods. Never stay where you were when you fired the last shot. A deer that hears 1 gunshot freezes. A deer that hears 2 shots from 2 different places runs in circles. His Jap pursuers were running in circles. He heard officers shouting orders in the tree line. He heard the confusion in their voices. They believed there were multiple Americans out here. They were tactically certain of it. No single rifleman moved this fast, changed positions this often, hit targets from this many angles. The reports the surviving Japanese officers would eventually file, the ones that would work their way back through their chain of command, would describe a stubborn and well-organized American defense manned by an unknown number of concealed riflemen with excellent fields of fire. The truth was one man. The truth was one exhausted farm boy with a shredded ear and a rifle that was starting to feel like part of his own arm. For a strange half-second, in the pause between one clip and the next, he thought about his mother. He thought about the house in Woodcliff, the tin roof, the smell of coffee before dawn, the way the light came through the pines in October. Then the thought was gone, because more men were coming out of the tree line, and there was no room in his head for anything but the front sight of his rifle. The eastern sky was starting to lighten. Not full dawn yet, just the faintest suggestion of gray at the horizon. Somewhere in the jungle behind him, a bird had begun to call. It was an ordinary jungle sound. It reminded him that the world outside this clearing still existed. That morning was coming whether he lived to see it or not. He needed more ammunition. He waited for a lull in the incoming fire. He counted to 3. Then he broke from his depression and ran back toward the ruined gun pit, zigzagging across open ground while rifle fire cracked around him. He dove the last 5 feet and landed among the men he had killed 20 minutes earlier. The smell hit him, blood, cordite, the copper stink of the dead. He had smelled this smell before. He had butchered hogs on the farm. He had gutted deer in the Georgia heat. His hands moved without hesitation. He stripped ammunition from every body he could reach. He found American clips in Japanese pouches. He found grenades on Japanese belts, Type 99 fragmentation grenades. He had been trained to recognize them and to use them if the situation demanded it. The situation demanded it. He pulled the pin on the first grenade. He struck the cap against the sandbag. He counted, and he threw it toward the sound of voices in the tree line. The explosion was followed by screaming. He was out of the pit and running again before the second grenade left his hand. He found a shell crater 15 yards away and dropped into it. 3 feet deep, enough cover to keep his head safe from direct fire. He could see the entire approach from the jungle. He counted the bodies between his position and the trees. 28, 29. Some of them were moving. Wounded men trying to crawl back toward their lines. He let them go. He was not there to kill everyone. He was there to hold the ground. A wounded man required 2 healthy soldiers to carry him out. Every casualty he created multiplied itself. He used the momentary lull to reload every empty clip he carried. His fingers worked without his mind. Press the rounds. Feel the spring. 8 per clip. He had enough ammunition for maybe 10 more reloads. 80 rounds. He did not know how many enemy soldiers were still in that jungle. But he knew the answer was more than 80. Somewhere on the other side of the camp, other Americans were fighting their own battles. He could hear the sound of it. The company commander was trying to organize a coherent defense across the entire perimeter. But in the dark and the chaos, coordination was almost impossible. McKinney did not know any of this. He knew only that no one had come to help him. The Japanese commander made a decision. He could not keep sending men across the killing ground in front of the gun pit. He shifted his axis of attack. He would swing his remaining force around McKinney's flank. He would hit the supply tents from the south. McKinney saw the officer through the trees, gesturing with an arm toward a different section of the American perimeter. He read the intention instantly. He climbed out of his crater and ran. 40 yards to the supply tents. He covered the distance in 8 seconds. He threw himself behind a stack of ammunition crates just as the first Japanese soldiers emerged from the jungle on the southern approach. They had not expected him to be there. They had expected an undefended flank. The lead element consisted of 12 soldiers moving in a tactical column. McKinney opened fire from a distance of 40 yards. The first 3 men went down before the others understood what had happened. The 4th and 5th tried to return fire but could not locate him among the crates. The 7th, 8th, and 9th broke and ran back toward the jungle. He tracked the ones who tried to hide. He tracked the ones who tried to run. He fired and reloaded and fired again. More soldiers emerged from the tree line. The Japanese commander was committing his reserve. 20 more men, maybe 25. They saw their comrades falling and hesitated at the edge of the jungle. That hesitation cost them 8 rounds. Reload. 8 rounds. The wave broke. 26 minutes into the fight, McKinney sat behind the ammunition crates and pressed a fresh bandage against his ear. The bandage came away almost black. His hearing on the right side was gone. His head throbbed with every heartbeat. He looked down at his hands. They were shaking, not from fear, from exhaustion, from blood loss, from whatever chemical reaction happens in a man's body when he has been asking it to do impossible things for almost half an hour without stopping. He watched his hands shake and understood, in a distant way, that he was probably going to die out here. It was a strange thing to know, and not particularly to mind. He was already inside a place beyond the fear of dying. He was inside the work. He could hear the enemy trying again. This time they came from two directions at once, splitting their fire, trying to force him to choose which threat to engage. He engaged both. He fired 4 rounds south. 2 men fell. He swung the rifle northeast. 4 rounds, 2 more men. The M1 pinged empty. He reloaded in under 3 seconds and fired south again. He was moving between angles like a fighter working 2 heavy bags. He was not thinking. He was pattern. He was reflex. He was every hour he had ever spent in a Georgia forest turned into a single continuous motion of eye and hand and steel. But the Japanese were learning too. Their surviving officers had finally understood. There was no interlocking defense. There was one man, one rifleman. They stopped attacking in waves. They began advancing individually. One man moving while another covered him, leapfrogging forward, closing the distance yard by yard. It was the tactic that would eventually kill him. Even the best marksman in the world cannot track 5 threats coming from 5 directions at slightly different times. McKinney recognized the pattern. He had watched coyotes work together this way, spreading out around a wounded deer, coming in from angles the deer could not cover all at once. The deer would turn to face one, and another would close from behind. He was the deer now. 31 minutes into the fight, the Japanese were 15 yards away on the northeast side of his position and 20 yards away on the south. He had fewer than 30 rounds left. He could hear them breathing. He could hear the small scrapes of equipment as they crawled forward. He did not wait for them to close the last distance. He burst out of the ammunition crates and ran directly at the group to the northeast. 5 men were crouched behind a fallen palm tree. They had been waiting for the rest of the assault team to close the pincer. They had not expected the target to come to them. He shot the first man while still moving. He shot the second as he reached the log. The third rose to meet him with a bayonet thrust, and the M1's butt caught the soldier under the jaw, and the fight became something older than firearms. The fourth man swung his rifle like a club, and McKinney went under the blow and drove the steel butt plate into the man's throat. The fifth turned to run and did not make it 3 steps. Behind him, the southern group had seen him leave his cover. They were sprinting toward the crates. He turned and fired. 2 dropped. He fired again. Another fell. The M1 pinged empty. 3 Japanese soldiers reached him before he could reload. The first tackled him around the waist. The second stomped on his wounded ear, and the pain went past pain into something white and silent. The third raised a bayonet for a killing thrust. McKinney grabbed the ankle of the man, on his head, and twisted. The soldier lost his balance and fell. McKinney rolled and threw off the man who had tackled him. The bayonet came down and buried itself in the dirt an inch from his chest. He was on his knees. He found his rifle. He swung it in a wide arc that caught one soldier across the temple and dropped him. He reversed the swing and drove the butt plate into another soldier's ribs and heard bones break. The third pulled his bayonet from the ground and lunged. McKinney blocked the thrust with the barrel of his rifle. The blade slid along the wood and gouged a furrow in the stock. He stepped inside the man's reach and slammed his forehead into the soldier's nose. The soldier staggered. McKinney hit him twice more with the rifle butt. The soldier stopped moving. 33 minutes. He stood among the bodies. His hands were slick. Some of the blood was his, and some of it was not, and he could not tell the difference anymore. For a moment, he looked down at one of the men at his feet. A young face, not much more than a boy. Somewhere in Japan, there was a mother who did not yet know that her son had died on a small island 6,000 miles from home. Somewhere there was a father who would learn about it in a telegram he could not bring himself to open. It was a thought McKinney did not have time for, but it passed through him anyway, in the space of a breath, and it left something behind that he would carry the rest of his life. Movement in his peripheral vision. 2 more Japanese soldiers coming out of the tree line to his right. He raised the rifle and found the chamber was empty. He had not reloaded since the hand-to-hand fight. He did not stop to reload. He charged them. He covered 10 yards in 3 strides. The first soldier tried to bring his rifle up and was too slow, and the M1's butt plate caught him under the chin. The second turned to run. McKinney chased him down and hit him from behind, and the man went into the dirt and did not get up. 34 minutes. He remembered the mortar crews. He had heard the knee mortars from the southwest. Somewhere out there, at least one Japanese 2-man team was still capable of dropping rounds on his position. If they repositioned observers, they could find him again. He found a loaded rifle among the dead, an M1 with a full clip. He picked it up. He dropped his own damaged weapon. The stock was cracked from repeated impacts against skulls. He started moving southwest. The mortar crews saw him coming. 2 men. They had been adjusting for another fire mission. Now they scrambled to defend themselves. One reached for a rifle. The other tried to arm a grenade. He shot them both from 45 yards. 35 minutes he stood in the growing morning light. He turned in a slow circle, yet his breath came in ragged pulls. His vision was blurring at the edges from exhaustion and blood loss. Every muscle in his body was screaming for him to sit down. The jungle was quiet. No more soldiers came from the trees. No more mortar rounds fell from the sky. There was only the moaning of wounded men and the buzz of flies already gathering on the dead. Somewhere far off, another bird began to call, then another. Ordinary sounds. Morning sounds. The world was still there. He was still in it. That fact was strange enough that he stood in the middle of the clearing for a long moment just to make sure it was true. He began to walk back toward the American perimeter. He was halfway there when he saw the figures coming toward him, American uniforms. Soldiers from Company A who had finally fought their way through to his section of the line. They stopped when they saw him. He was covered in blood from his head to his boots. He was carrying a rifle that was not the rifle he had started with. He was standing in the middle of a field of bodies stretching from the tree line all the way to the perimeter wire. He lowered his weapon. The lead soldier looked at him, looked at the ground around him, looked back at him. He did not speak. There was nothing to say. 36 minutes had passed since the sword had come down through the canvas above John McKinney's head. The battle was over, but no one on either side yet understood what had actually happened here. The soldiers of 2nd Platoon stood in the morning light and tried to understand what they were looking at. They had been fighting on the western edge of the perimeter when the attack began. It had taken them the better part of 36 minutes to push their way through to McKinney's section of the line. They had come expecting to find survivors. They had come expecting to find bodies. They had not come expecting to find this. The ground in front of them stretched roughly 100 yards from the tree line to the ruined machine gun position. That ground was covered with the dead, not scattered, not in groups of 2 or 3 the way a normal skirmish leaves them. Whole clusters of enemy soldiers slumped over fallen logs. Bodies piled against sandbags. Courses stretched along the ground in the shape of an assault that had been broken over and over from different angles, and in the middle of it stood a single American private who looked like he had walked out of a slaughterhouse. The platoon sergeant ordered a count. His men moved through the field slowly. Some of them were veterans of the New Guinea campaign. They had seen bad things. They had seen a great many bad things. But they had not seen what they were seeing now, which was the physical evidence of what an entire platoon was supposed to do, and doing it against odds that no platoon should have been able to survive. The count took 20 minutes. When his men reported back to him, the platoon sergeant did not accept the number they gave him. He told them to count again. He watched them do it this time. He walked the ground with them. He looked at every body. The number was the same on the second count. 38 dead Japanese soldiers lay in the immediate area of the machine gun position and the shell craters McKinney had used as fighting positions. 2 more bodies lay near the knee mortar site 45 yards to the southwest. Approximately 40 enemy soldiers, killed by 1 man in 36 minutes. The sergeant found McKinney sitting on an ammunition crate near the supply tents. He was pressing a bloody rag against what was left of his right ear. His uniform was torn in a dozen places. His hands were still shaking, though he was trying to hold them still. The sergeant sat down beside him. He asked McKinney what had happened. McKinney gave a short account. The tent, the sword, the machine gun, the waves. He spoke in the flat, quiet voice of a man who was not fully in the moment. He did not embellish anything. He did not describe his own courage. He described events the way a witness might describe a car accident to observe from a safe distance. The sergeant listened. Then the sergeant said what any sergeant would have said. He told McKinney that this was not possible. He told him that one man could not do what the ground in front of them showed had been done. There must have been others, other riflemen, someone supporting him from a covered position, someone he had lost track of in the chaos. McKinney shook his head slowly. There had been no one else. The sergeant did not believe him. It was not that he thought McKinney was lying. He thought McKinney was confused. Combat did strange things to memory. Blood loss did stranger things. The sergeant went to check the records. He found that every other American in Company A was accounted for. Hendricks and the third soldier from the machine gun crew had made it to the aid station with bayonet wounds. Every other soldier had been fighting on other sections of the perimeter, and every one of them could account for his own actions during the 36 minutes of the attack. There had been no one else at McKinney's section of the line. There had been no one else at all. The sergeant walked the ground again with two of his men. He looked at where the spent M1 casings lay. He looked at the direction of the wounds on the Japanese bodies. He looked at the pattern of movement suggested by the firing positions. Everything matched McKinney's account. The bodies inside the gun pit had been killed at close range, some by gunshot and some by blunt force. The bodies in the field showed wounds from 3 or 4 distinct firing positions, all of them shifting as the fight progressed. The bodies near the fallen palm log and the ones near the mortar site each told their own small piece of the same larger story. One rifleman, multiple positions, continuous movement. It was true. Company A's commanding officer was informed of what his men had found. He listened to the platoon sergeant's report. He went out to the field himself. He walked among the bodies. He looked at the count sheet. He asked the same questions the sergeant had asked and got the same answers. He forwarded the report up to battalion. Battalion did not believe it either. Combat reports were often inflated. Soldiers under stress made mistakes about numbers. Enemy dead were routinely overstated by units trying to justify their own losses. Battalion asked for confirmation. Regiment asked for confirmation. When the report finally reached the headquarters of the 33rd Infantry Division, someone at division decided that this was a matter that required a formal investigation. They sent a team. The team arrived at Dingalan Bay a few days later. They interviewed McKinney at length. They interviewed the men from 2nd Platoon who had reached his position first. They interviewed the men who had been fighting on other sections of the perimeter. They walked the ground. They counted the bodies again, this time with photographs. They examined the terrain and the fields of fire. Some accounts made later and by observers with reason to inflate their numbers would put the total Japanese dead at that outpost even higher. That was not the official finding. The official finding was more careful. It stated that approximately 40 enemy soldiers could be directly attributed to the actions of Private John R. McKinney, based on the physical evidence and the eyewitness testimony available. 40. It was the number that would appear in official documents. It was the number that would eventually be read aloud in a room in the White House. The recommendation for the Medal of Honor was forwarded through channels in June of 1945. The Medal of Honor is the highest military decoration awarded by the government of the United States. Fewer than 3,500 of them have been given out since the medal was created during the Civil War. The criteria are specific and demanding. The recipient must have distinguished himself conspicuously by gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. The reviewing officers at the War Department read McKinney's file. They looked at the investigation report. They looked at the ballistic evidence. They looked at the eyewitness statements. They reached the same conclusion the division investigators had reached, which was the same conclusion the sergeant on the ground had eventually reached, which was that this had actually happened, and the man who had done it deserved his country's highest honor. The war ended in August of 1945. McKinney had been in the Philippines when Nagasaki fell. He was among the millions of American servicemen who would slowly find their way home in the following months, as the enormous machinery of demobilization spun up and moved men across the Pacific on ships and troop transports and long, slow flights. He came home to Georgia in the fall. He did not talk about the war. His family noticed, his mother noticed, his brothers and sisters noticed. He was not the same young man who had left for Fort McPhern 3 years earlier. He was quieter. He was harder to reach. There were long silences where before there had been at least a few soft words. He did not tell them what had happened at Dingalan Bay. He did not tell anyone. On February 6th of 1946, John McKinney stood in the White House. He was 25 years old. He was wearing his dress uniform. His right ear was still visibly damaged. The scar tissue ran down the side of his neck. President Harry S. Truman placed the Medal of Honor around his neck. The citation was read aloud in the formal military language of such occasions. It described extreme gallantry and unsurpassed intrepidity. It described a lone soldier who had thwarted an assault that threatened to annihilate his entire company. It said the words that the United States government uses when it wants to acknowledge something that ordinary words cannot quite reach. McKinney did not make a speech. He shook the president's hand. He nodded when it was appropriate to nod. He answered a small number of questions from reporters using the fewest possible words. When one of the reporters asked him what it had been like out there, he said something short. Then he changed the subject. Then he found a way to end the conversation. The press called him the Audie Murphy of the Pacific. Murphy had received his Medal of Honor for holding off German forces almost single-handedly at a place called Holzwihr in France. He had climbed on top of a burning tank destroyer and used its heavy machine gun to break up an armored attack. He had become the most decorated American soldier of the war. He had also become, after the war, a movie star. McKinney would not become a movie star. McKinney would go home to Scavenging County, Georgia. He walked back into a life that would have been completely recognizable to any of his ancestors going back several generations. He worked, he hunted, he fished in the same creeks that had raised him. He got by, he got married, he raised a family. He put the Medal of Honor in a drawer. The neighbors knew, in a vague way, that John McKinney had done something in the war. There had been a newspaper article at the time of the White House ceremony. Some of the older folks in the county remembered reading it. But John himself never brought it up. He never wore the medal. He never went to reunions. He never gave interviews. For decades, if you had asked most people in Scavenging County who lived on the old McKinney place, they would have said that a quiet farmer named John lived there. They would not have told you he was a Medal of Honor recipient. They would not have told you what he had done on Luzon in the last months of the war. Not because they were keeping a secret, because most of them did not know. He had chosen it that way. The nights were different. His family would say later, when they finally said anything at all, that the nights had never really stopped being 1945 for him. He would wake suddenly, reaching for a rifle that was not there. He would make sounds in his sleep. Sometimes he would sit up in the darkness and stare at the wall for a long time before he could lie back down. There was no name yet for what he was living with. Post-traumatic stress disorder would not become a recognized clinical diagnosis until 1980. In 1946 and 1956 and 1966, veterans who came home carrying the war inside them were told to forget about it. Be grateful you survived. Move on with your life. Do not talk about what you saw. McKinney did what his generation did. He buried it. He worked. He raised children. He watched the world change around him. He watched Korea come and go. He watched Vietnam come and go. He watched new wars produce new heroes and new veterans, each generation of them coming home with their own version of the same silence he had been carrying since 1945. He did not talk to them either. In the mid-1960s, a Nevada-based writer named Forrest Bryant Johnson began to hear rumors about a Medal of Honor recipient in rural Georgia who had done something almost unbelievable in the Philippines. Johnson was a veteran himself. He understood the kind of man he was looking for. He began to research the story. The research took a long time. McKinney did not want to talk. Most attempts to interview him ran into a wall of polite silence. Many of the men who had served with him were dead. The military records were scattered across multiple archives. Some of them had been damaged by the fire at the National Personnel Records Center in St. Louis in 1973. But Johnson kept going. He interviewed the family members who would speak with him. He tracked down what witnesses he could find. He read the Medal of Honor citation and the after-action reports. He walked the ground of Scavenging County the way McKinney had walked it as a boy. He put the pieces together. The book was called Phantom Warrior. It was published in 2007. McKinney did not live to see it. He died on March 11, 1997, in Sylvania, Georgia. He was 76 years old. He had lived nearly 52 years past the morning at Dingalan Bay. He had married. He had raised a family. He had worked and fished and hunted the same woods where he had grown up. He had never quite gotten over any of it, but he had lived a full life anyway, which is more than many veterans of the Pacific War managed to do. He was buried in Scavenging County, not far from the land where his father had once been a sharecropper, not far from the woods that had raised him. 20 years after his death, the state of Georgia decided to honor him again. In 2017, the state legislature voted to designate a section of highway in Scavenging County as the John R. McKinney Medal of Honor Highway. There was a ceremony. Members of the McKinney family attended. Local veterans came. A few reporters wrote articles that most of the country did not read. The highway sign stands there today. Most of them do not know the story. Most of them do not know that the quiet farmer, whose name is on that sign, killed approximately 40 men in 36 minutes with a rifle and his bare hands to save a company of sleeping Americans he barely knew. They do not know about the sword or the tent or the machine gun. They do not know about the boy who never missed. They do not know that this quiet man carried something inside him for the rest of his life that he never once tried to make into a story about himself. He did not think of himself as a hero. He was asked about it in the few interviews he could not avoid, and he said what men of his generation always said in that situation. He said he did what he had to do. He said he was just trying to stay alive. He said the men who did not come home were the real heroes. He did not want the medal. He did not want the attention. He wanted to go back to Georgia and be left alone with the woods. Approximately 40 men in 36 minutes. One rifle. One farm boy from Scavenging County. One morning in the Philippines that should have ended in the massacre of an American company and ended instead in something that nobody on either side of that fight could ever fully explain. That is the story of Private John R. McKinney. It is a true story. Every detail can be found in the official records of the United States Army, in the Medal of Honor citation signed on his behalf, in the investigation conducted by the 33rd Infantry Division, and in the careful research of Forrest Bryant Johnson, whose book preserved details that would otherwise have been lost with the men who witnessed them. It is also a story that could easily have been lost. If John McKinney had come home from the war and never worn the medal and never told anyone what he did, and if no writer had ever come looking for him, and if the state of Georgia had never named a road for him, we might not be sitting here talking about him tonight. His name might have gone into the same silence that has swallowed so many other quiet men who came back from wars and did not want to talk about them. Instead, his name is on a highway sign. His name is in a book. His name is being spoken right now, in your ears, by a stranger decades after his death, in a country he served without ever asking for anything in return. If you have made it this far, then you are part of the reason these stories do not disappear. You are the reason John McKinney and the men like him get to be remembered, not as movie characters, not as legends, as real human beings who did real and terrible and necessary things in a war their country asked them to fight. Take a moment tonight, if you would, and think about the men in your own family who served, the fathers, the grandfathers, the uncles. The ones who came home and did not talk about it. The ones who tucked their honors away in drawers. The ones who lived quiet lives and carried heavy things inside them until the day they died. They were all somebody's John McKinney. They all deserve to be remembered. If someone in your family served, tell us about them in the comments below. A name, a branch, a theater of war. Just a few words. Let them be remembered here, too, alongside the man from Scavenging County who never asked to be. Thank you for listening. Thank you for staying with this story to the end. And thank you, wherever you are watching from tonight, for helping keep the names of these men alive a little longer.